in terms of the economy, just briefly, we get hung up on today or yesterday, but over the last 10 years, what we've seen in Australia is amazing growth, amazing sort of changes in terms of our affluence and wealth, but also a major increase in the number of people employed doing things. Now, we don't mean employed as in an employment relationship as opposed to self-employed. We mean doing stuff, employed being paid for doing things, whatever form. Unemployment coming down, and although it's kicked up recently with the global financial crisis, it's still nowhere near the high levels. So we have more people in Australia engaged in doing things. Interesting chart that we should all sort of take to heart. When employment hits, that big number there, it hits youngsters. So unemployment hits youngsters and it has a massive flow through. And one of the things we'll see, if anyone looks through this sort of report, you'll see independent contractors, self-employed people tend not to be youngsters. So those youngsters tend to engage, first of all, with the normal sort of workforce. Briefly, voting intention. I mentioned that the Labor Party was well ahead. Just to put this into perspective, the decade or so that we had of a very conservative LNP government was one during that time when even during that time you had the vast majority of the population of Australia was supportive of an ALP government. So this country has been, over the last 10 years or so, increasingly progressive, increasingly supportive of the Labor Party and the sort of policies and values, if you like, of the Labor Party. This sort of flies in the face of the average self-employed or independent contractor. As we'll see in the report, they tend to have a different view. But it is important to see that even when the LNP was being re-elected, it was an unusual situation given the big picture. The Australian psyche is moving more towards the left. Now, I want to just briefly go through some of these some of the things that we've found about these self-employed people. And it really is a starting point, because one of the important things is there's not one group of homogenous self-employed or independent contractors. You know, that's a bit like saying, let's understand Australians or let's understand humans. But if we can look at them compared to the rest of the population, it gives us a little bit of a start. So first of all, we see that there are marginally more men than women, 2 to 1. Males than females in a self-employed situation. They tend to be not in the younger group or the older group, they tend to be in that sort of middle group, and you can see the different state breakdown there. This is all in the report, so I'm just going to hit some highlights. Respondent income. The average income of a self-employed person in Australia today is just over $63,000, which is higher than the average for an Australian. We have about 17% earning over $100,000, which you can see is much higher than the average. And we have about 16% earning under $20,000. So there's extremes. There's self-employed and independent contractors all over that income spectrum. Now, the charts we show are essentially ones where this is the norm, 100. So if something's over to the right, that's the extent to which the subgroup, in this case self-employed, are more likely to be like that. So we have these people, self-employed people, very strongly and more likely to be professionals and managers. In fact, in terms of percentages, 42% of the self-employed folk that we dealt with are professionals or managers. Only 17% white collar, 18% skilled workers, and 16% semi and unskilled. 6% are farm owners, but you can see that's very extreme because, you know, hardly anyone else is a farm owner if they're not self-employed. Also, very strongly at the top end of the socio-economic status quintile. So essentially a quintile means 20% of the population. You'd expect 20% of people to be in that top AB quintile. In fact, there are 25% of self-employed. So self-employed people tend to be at the top end of the socio-economic spectrum, either in that A, B or the C quintile. They are definitely, for the most part, not in the bottom low end of those quintiles. From an economic perspective, they're also much more likely to be big spenders. About a third of the population are classified by us as big spenders. That is, they're spending a whole lot of money. We ask people what they spend their money on, how much they spend, add it all up and put it into groups. And we find self-employed people, 49% of them, almost half of them, fall into that big spender category. So from an economic perspective, hugely important. We also see then, and this is the stuff where, you know, if you're interested, you can pore through the report because it's all here, but just some highlights. Don't trust the Australian government. So they're very strongly on that. Don't think the government's doing a good job. They're very low, thinking the Australian government's doing a good job. And I think we started to pick up some of that just from the presentations or the discussions we heard this morning. And also in terms of how they feel about society and charity. I prefer to support longer term development and projects rather than emergency and crisis appeals. So there's a sense coming through here that there's a self-sufficiency. I want people to be self-sufficient. I want to be self-sufficient myself. There's a question here, I believe a percentage of everyone's income should go to charities. Very low. And yet, you know, I do a lot of work for the not-for-profit segment. They actually rely on that sort of stuff coming through. I always read the business section of the newspaper. These people, for the most part, are very engaged in these kinds of things. I'm more interested in my job than my house. I think that was coming through. People who are self-employed, independent contractors are really engaged with the work they're doing, their job. That's coming through very, very strongly. This issue, I can't relax down the bottom until the house is clean. That is not a top priority. It's about the job. They are what they do, their job and the thing that they're engaged in. They're doing a whole bunch of things though. These are not just sort of workaholics who are locked away, although our second person seems to have been locked away a bit more than he deserves. You know, they're getting out and doing a whole bunch of things. I thought this was interesting. Used the yellow directory in the last 4 weeks. So very much engaging with other businesses and looking things up. Watching pay TV is coming through, accessing the internet very strongly. But they're not into, at the bottom end, not into sort of local community things, not into unaddressed mail and catalogues. So there's very much, I think, an engaged, I'm doing what I need to do, what I want to do, what I choose to do, as opposed to stuff that's thrown at me, I can actually choose to do that or not as I choose. So heavy newspaper readers, light commercial TV viewers, heavy internet users, heavy addressed mail users, very light unaddressed mail users. It makes sense from a sociological perspective. You know, if something's addressed to you, you're going to deal with it because it's potentially a business thing. You're very engaged in your business. The unaddressed mail seems to be just not being taken much notice of. Pretty important finding. So those are some key things. The report's there. I hope you bothered to stick your USB drive in and have a look at it. There's also an analysis by TUI which shows how the Roy Morgan data, which enables us to profile these people, relates to the ABS data. But as I said, there's a lot more to understand in this group of people who are, you know, quite heterogeneous. There's a whole lot of different kinds of people falling into this grab bag of self-employed or independent contractors. Thank you.